Podcast Day 2019. We are back. We are continuing to stream around the world. If you've been following it using the hashtag International Podcast Day, it's a lot going on out there right now. We love it. We love it. So this hour, we are joined with several, as you can see, 3 different podcasters, Steph, Greg, Eric, in Canada and in China. So we're going to be talking about a little expat podcasters in Asia. So welcome in, everybody. How are you doing tonight?
Hey,
Great.
Doing good.
Good morning.
Good.
All right.
Awesome.
So first and foremost, congrats to all the winners of the People's Choice Awards that just happened. That was an impressive crew of folks.
It's always fun to be a part of that event and stream it here over at internationalpodcastday.com/live. And it's great. It's truly an International Podcast Awards, which is definitely cool. Definitely cool.
Right on.
Well, before I hand it over to you guys, I do want to thank everybody for tuning in. And of course, we want to give a little shout out to our sponsors that actually make International Podcast Day a thing every year. And of course, thanks to the community, thanks to the presenters and speakers every year. So head over to internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors. Our platinum sponsor this year is Blueberry, a full service podcasting company providing podcast hosting, podcast stats, and podcast advertising opportunities. You can find more at blueberry.com. Our gold sponsor, repurpose.io, automatically converts your audio podcast into engaging videos and uploads them to YouTube, Facebook, and other social media channels. You can check them out for free over at repurpose.io/IPD. Of course, Libsyn is our other gold sponsor. They are a podcast hosting, distribution, and monetization solution for audio and video podcasters worldwide. You can reach your audience everywhere and on the most popular audience destinations like Spotify and Pandora. Find them over at libsyn.com. And of course, our streaming partner this year, StreamYard.com. Really great quality audio and video going on right now. You can use their service for free. And also, thank you to our celebration supporters, Second Line Themes, Geeks Rising, Synth, Outlier HQ, and Focusrite. Again, head over to internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors to find some cool free stuff that you can enter in and also discounted services from a lot of our sponsors. Well, Steph, Greg, and Eric, I'm glad we all connected. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to represent yourselves, what you've been doing in the podcasting space. And I am going to get out of the way. And thank you so much for being a part of the event.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Steve, and thank you, everybody that makes International Podcast Day possible. For those of you in North America, Eric, Greg, and I are coming to you from the future. It's already International Podcast Day where we are in Asia, and we're going to go around and quickly introduce ourselves, and I'll tell you a little bit about the format of our panel, and then we'll dive in. Eric, would you please introduce yourself and your podcast?
Sure. I'm the host of the China and Africa podcast. Now, that sounds like a little bit of a niche podcast for a lot of folks, but believe it or not, China is a topic that everybody's interested in now around the world. We've been doing this for 10 years and built up quite a sizable audience in the US, in China, in Africa, in all parts, just for people who are interested in not only what's going on in Africa, but around the world. And we do this as part of the China Africa Project, and you can find out more at chinaafricaproject.com.
And Greg.
Yeah, well, I am one of the two. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Bangkok Podcast.com, and we're based in Bangkok, and we talk about Bangkok every week and what a crazy, strange, wonderful, annoying, amazing city it is. And we started the first season of the podcast in 2010. That ran for a year. We took a couple years break, and then we started it up again in 2016, and it's been going out every week since then. And we're about to start season 4 in 2 weeks. So we really have fun doing it. Never a lack of things to talk about Bangkok. It's always seems to be something in the air that we can manage to debate and discuss and argue about. So we have a lot of fun doing it.
For sure. And Stephanie. Oh, yeah, that's me. Hey, a Geopats podcast is one of my projects. And we talk to expats and geopats about a variety of niche topics like books, the internet, language, that kind of thing. And now podcasts about, things that are affected by where they are in their host country or host countries, if they are a serial expat like I am. All right. So in this panel today, we are going to be talking about different aspects of podcasting outside our home/passport countries. I do want to do a tiny disclaimer. The word expat, we are using incredibly loosely. We're using it just for people who live outside of their home or passport countries. There can be a lot of debate on what that word means and who is included in it. And for the sake of this panel, we say everyone who moves outside their passport country, and we can debate the rest of it offline off of this panel.
It's a good idea. It's a good idea.
Yeah, it can get sticky. So we're also, I'm keeping an eye on the chat room, and we will have time for those questions at about 40 past the hour. All right, let's dive in. Eric and Greg, y'all ready?
Ready.
I'm ready.
All right. So question one that we have prepared. Why? I love this question. Why did you start your podcast? Greg, can you lead us off?
Yeah, well, it was just seemed like something interesting to do. It was at the time, it was something that not everyone knew about, and it seemed sort of niche and cool and an interesting new technology to dive into. And I got to be honest too. I think that podcasting is part loving to hear your own voice. You know, I sort of like, well, no one wants to listen to me. Well, I'll make people listen to me. I'm going to broadcast my voice around the world. So I think that's part of it, but it was just really the cool technical aspects of putting an audio show together and pushing it out to the world. And a big part of it, to be honest, was that there's a lot of stereotypes about Bangkok, that it's just a place of sin and parties and red light districts, and that's it. But there's so much more here that makes it such a great city, and we really wanted to talk about that. So we interview people, for everyone from politicians to movie stars to monks. And me and my co-host talk about life in the city. So there's just so much here to explore that doesn't get covered by the stereotypes and preconceptions that most people have. And that's where the impetus really came from.
Yeah, for me, it was a situation where I was a China journalist for many years. I was with the Associated Press, with CNN, with the BBC. And then in 2005, I started traveling to Africa to visit my brother who was living in the DR Congo. Now, in 2005, there were no Chinese in Kinshasa. There was one Chinese restaurant. And I thought, okay, that's kind of interesting. I didn't really expect to see any Chinese in Congo. By 2006, there were 2 Chinese restaurants. And I thought, that's interesting. But by 7, 8, and 9, something profound had happened. It just went boom. There were Chinese everywhere. Chinese construction, Chinese restaurants, Chinese immigrants. And it just seemed like it changed overnight. In 2010, I moved to Kinshasa to run my brother's production company there. And so I started talking to people because in the West, I was reading in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, China was conquering Africa. China was invading Africa. China was taking over. And it was this very kind of black and white type of framing. And when I asked my Congolese employees and friends, I said, what do you think of the Chinese? And they gave me these really complex, nuanced answers. And I said, that's my story. Mm-hmm. That nuance is really fascinating. And that's something that people aren't hearing on the outside, where there's as much good as there is bad. And we don't hear that nuance. So when I left the Congo and moved to Paris to work for Radio France International and France 24 as the editor-in-chief there, I tried to pitch stories to our Africa desk about the Chinese. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. We don't want to cover the Chinese. So I said, I don't need you. I can start up a podcast. I can do it myself. And so back in 2010, long before anybody knew actually what podcasting really was on a mass level, I just started doing this. And I reached out on Twitter for a co-host. And Kobus, my co-host, joined me. And we've been podcasting 50 shows a year for 10 years now on the subject.
Wow.
Yeah. I got to say, asking Twitter for a co-host is brave.
Right? Yeah.
Listen, I met my wife online. I met my co-host online. So, it works.
That's amazing. I met my co-host of my other podcast online too, actually.
Oh,
so
all right.
It happens. It happens.
Yeah. Co-hosts. That's what for podcast co-hosts. That would be great.
Yeah. Well, she was a guest first, and now we co-host a different podcast, but not this one. Hi, Summer. Anyway, see, already I see. Well, I knew this beforehand, but already the audience can see the differences that location plays in our different podcasts. Like Greg, you were about a city. Your podcast is about a city. Eric, your podcast is about a country and a continent and how they relate to each other. And for me, the Geopats podcast, why I started that is because I had a pretty intense experience the first time I lived overseas, and I blogged and blogged and blogged and blogged, and I could never find a place to put it. So I started podcasting to have that story be heard. So similar to what Greg was saying, somebody listen to me. And it evolved. And eventually I started talking to other expats because I found what they were doing, like the two of you, was also inspiring. So it turned into more of a conversation, but it was about being heard, about a niche topic being talked about in a way I wanted to hear it myself. So yeah, location. Question: has your why changed at all?
Our why?
Yeah, the why of why you started your podcast. Has it changed throughout the time that you've done the podcast?
Not for me. No, I think we still want to. I mean, maybe originally we started to sort of let people know, hey, there's more to Bangkok than just these things. But now it's just, we sort of wanted to mine the very rich vein of people and cultures and stories. And it really is a melting pot, to use a term that I learned in grade 10 social studies. And it really is, as you guys probably know, being located overseas, it's like sort of this crossroads of all these weird people and cultures and stories and histories and stuff that are just like sitting there waiting to be talked about. And so we sort of moved, I guess, from wanting to like expose the secret, like there's more to Bangkok than this, than just sort of just existing in Bangkok and talking about what it's like living here as an expat. We're not really for tourists. We don't do like the top 10 things to do in Bangkok or anything like that. So we're more geared to expats.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And your music episode on different local venues to go to.
Right, our live music episode.
That one. Yeah, I point people to that one all the time. That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was fun to do. And unfortunately, we had to do a bunch of research. So I had to tell my wife, sorry, I've got to go out.
Oh, no.
Some live music gigs.
Too funny. And Eric?
So our why hasn't changed. It's only intensified. When we started this back in 2010, China wasn't the polarizing issue that it is today. Now, China, for a lot of people, is a binary thing. You either love China and you're a panda hugger, or you're a dragon slayer and you hate China. There's very little space in between, and we are absolutely passionate about staying in that middle space. We don't advocate for the U.S., for Africa, for Europe, for China. We really are very, very, again, passionate is the best word to say, about being independent, nonpartisan. My job is to try and poke holes in everybody's hypocrisies. And so the why in the beginning was to provide, for lack of a better phrase, fair and balanced information on this very complex issue that a lot of people still struggle to understand. And staying nonpartisan and independent has been the secret of our success, because people really come to us as people who don't have any stake in the outcome of this discussion. And so that was our why in the beginning. It's much more a why today because of the sensitivities that are around China, and particularly around the United States, I will say as much now. China and the US are equally provocative in many people's eyes. So this is complex territory to be walking in, and it's something that we're very passionate. We love very much.
Very true. And the similarities in the two countries, when they don't want to see that they're similar, I think is something that you guys touch on very often, that is necessary for us to hear.
That they're like the other. That's the problem.
Yeah.
So true. Well, the name of Geopats has changed more times than I'd like to admit. And we just did a massive rebranding too. But the essential core of it has been telling expat stories, whether it was mine or somebody else's or a very niche version of it. It's something happens when you leave the place that you grew up with. Your view on things permanently changes, for some more than others, but you see things differently. Even if you live in a place for a while, you still have a different lens on things. And I thought that lens was interesting, and I wanted to help tell more of those stories. So that essentially is the same.
Yeah.
Just in different niche ways. What are the logistics of producing your podcast? And specifically, are there any local restrictions or advantages that you have being in the country that you're in? Who wants to start with this one? Eric?
Eric, you go.
Sure. I won't say there's any advantages. I mean, I'm located in Vietnam. I was in China with you, Steph, in Shanghai for a number of years. I would say there's more obstacles than there are advantages in the sense of just from the technology point of view. In China, you're wrestling with the Great Firewall and the VPN issue, and that is a battle that never ends, particularly at sensitive times like this, where there's a big event coming up tomorrow in Beijing. The VPNs get harder and harder to use. The access to the outside world is more difficult. Coordinating with guests. Normally you'll use, Google Calendars, and you'll use Zoom, or you'll use these common web tools, which in China you simply can't use. So you have to really make an effort to overcome that. Here in Vietnam, it's like a lot of developing countries, bandwidth is always an issue. So that is, some days it's good, and some days, well, it's just not. And when I was back in the US last week, and I see people getting 100 megs up and down just on a normal, Time Warner cable connection, I just think to myself, if I get a good 15 or 20, then that's a good day. So that is, I think, when you're in developing countries or countries with restrictive governments, as I often spend time in, that's one challenge. The other challenge is that our guests oftentimes are even worse situations. So either they're in restrictive governments or they're in countries with even worse bandwidth than where I am. So when we're talking about Nigeria, Botswana, those are countries which have rather inconsistent, even South Africa, which is the most advanced economy in Africa, its internet connections are terrible. And so it can make it very difficult. So one of the things that we do is we do what's called a double ender on all of ours. So we don't use Skype or Zoom anymore to record. We only use a Skype and Zoom to facilitate a discussion. And then we have everybody record on their cell phone. And then I stitch those all together, and we get really good quality audio. And that's how we overcome the kind of logistical challenges and some of the bandwidth challenges. But so you have to be very creative when you're living outside of the US or outside of Europe, where you take for granted that the infrastructure just always works.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. It's the exact same thing here in Thailand, and we do a double ender as well. So each of our guests, if they can set it up properly, and my co-host every week and we record to our local machines, and then we talk over Facebook usually. But there have been times when the internet is crapped out or something, and we continue recording, but we pick up the phone, and then we're talking on the phone, but we're recording the podcast as we chat on the phone. So it's really kind of a ghetto way to do it, but it works. And similar to what you said, Eric, in Thailand, there are certain people and institutions that we just wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. Yeah. There's no upside to it. So we have to be careful of what we say. And in season 1, we did a whole episode about this, about self-censorship. And you just, some people think you're copping out if you don't, fight the man, fight the power, and stand up to whatever. But, there's realities to that. I've got a lot to lose. And as expats, I think we have to live with the reality that it can all end one day if someone is unhappy. Very quickly.
So on that self-censorship issue, so for us, we are fortunate because there's something called 4THKXJ, and it's getting longer and longer.
What is that?
This is how I remember the things you don't talk about in China. So 4T is Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen, the party. HK is Hong Kong, and then XJ is Xinjiang. So luckily, all of those things, which are the red lines, which make expats vulnerable in a place like China, fortunately for us, do not touch directly on our podcast and on the topics that we're going on. So we don't have to avoid these sensitive issues because nobody in Africa really cares that much about Tibet. But it is something that we think about. And as Greg, as you pointed out, and this is hard to explain to people outside, who say, you're not covering this issue. It ends very quickly. Yeah. They come to your door, there's a ticket, you're gone. And so we don't self-censor that much, but it is something that is never very far from our minds when I was living in China. Now that I'm not living in China, I don't have to be as concerned about it. But it's a real thing. It's definitely a real thing.
Yeah,
I'm a little geo jealous of that because I'm still dealing with that, especially during the ceremony.
XJ, remember that.
I know. Well, when I first moved to China, the first time I was here was 2010, and there were only 3 T's, so it has definitely increased since then. It's gotten bigger. I do want to bring up one slight advantage is when I'm talking to people in other countries. Sometimes when I introduce myself, it sticks out a little bit more because I am living in Shanghai, and that's a place they don't know a lot about. So there is that advantage where it's not just another American podcaster. Not that there's anything wrong with American podcasters, but it's that the location sometimes is an advantage for me. But I do deal with all the things that Eric was talking about. And I also deal with the splinternet as far as the China internet, the rest of the internet, as far as where to host. I host with Podbean outside of China. I don't publish my podcast inside of China. I can. People do. I know people that do. It's just there's more things that get taken down that I'm comfortable with, and I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to put my work into the world to have somebody else censor it. So I just don't. So there's a lot of publicity. This is the biggest market in the world, and I'm not advertising my podcast here. So there's a bit of a conundrum there, as I'm in a big market and I'm not tapping into it.
And I don't publish, even though I speak, read, and write Chinese fluently, I don't do any content in Chinese because the Chinese government doesn't have the same sensitivity for white people talking to other foreigners as they do. All of a sudden, when they think that you're talking to their people, you then are subject to their censorship and their scrutiny. So like you, Steph, I avoid all domestic Chinese distribution and marketing and content production.
Right. And there's I'm sorry.
I was going to say that's interesting because one of the things that we always try to avoid, because my co-host Ed, he's from America and I'm Canadian. We're both white men. We want to really avoid just being two more white guys in Thailand spouting off about Thailand and culture and stuff like that. Here's what I think, and here's what I would change, and here's how to fix this problem. You know, people get really sensitive about that, and rightly so. So we always try to get as many Thai people on as guests as possible. We don't want to always have like foreigners on as guests, but it's really sometimes a challenge because a lot of Thais they have to speak pretty good English, which is often sometimes a challenge because language skills in Thailand are not really the best in the region. And also a lot of Thais, if they're in any position of importance, have a real problem with going on the record about anything. So, you know, I'd love to get someone on from the government, from this department to talk officially about something in a positive light, but no one wants to I don't want to.
That's very much in China.
Oh yeah, one of the shows because I have multiple shows on the Geopats podcast, and one of them is Changing Scripts, and we talk about learning and using Mandarin Chinese. And I don't just have people learning Chinese; I have people who grew up with Chinese learning English, or at least I tried to. But even language, which can be political, but not as much as a lot of topics, I have a hard time even anonymizing people, not using their name, like it just being an audio project. A lot of people just say no. They don't want to come on and talk about how they learned English and just quirky differences between the two languages. They just don't want to do it. I have a very hard time getting locals on record. And Eric, I think you said you've had that problem over the years. It's
a big challenge, the same as Greg, where we want to get more local people. I'm not, I mean, again, we approach the topic, and Greg, I'm sure you're the same way, in an extraordinarily humble way. And so we're not coming on as white guys saying we know how to do things better. What we are trying to do is be vehicles for all a range of voices, a diversity of voices that are not usually heard in these debates, particularly young people, women, people from impacted countries. So we strive very hard. And if you go to our website, you can see all of the faces and all of the guests that we have. And there is a lot of diversity. But it is an issue to find that balance between, for us, between Chinese, Africans, and international. And a lot of Chinese are reluctant, or as Greg pointed out, English is also an issue because getting people who don't speak English is hard for a podcast. It's not the same as even radio or TV, only because people listen with the earbuds deep in their head. And you notice the lack of comprehension much more than you would, say, on a radio or another channel.
Right.
Do you think that we feel these restrictions more because we're not from the culture that we're in, or do you think that locals have the same issues that we have?
Eric, you go with this one.
I think locally, sometimes, so in China, people, they're not doing the same kind of podcast. I'm approaching this with a very international journalistic standard. And that is, so they'll approach it in a different way. So I went to Podfest. You and I went to Podfest in Shanghai earlier this year, and there were some amazing Chinese podcasters there. And they don't have a problem reaching out to guests, but they're doing a very different kind of show. And they're talking about very, very different kinds of things. And so a lot of times in that case, one, language isn't an issue. So that immediately makes it easier for them compared to what Greg and I are having to deal with. And two, there is the self-censorship is baked into the process because they both know what you say and what you don't say. Whereas for us, they're worried about it. That being said, I don't think Chinese government officials go on to Chinese podcasts either. So I think they face a lot of the same obstacles, but I do think it's slightly easier for them because they're doing something different than we are.
Right.
Yeah, they're looking at it from a different. I mean, it's weird being an expat in Bangkok anyway. Is just sort of you almost exist in a different bubble, and I this is shameful considering I've been in Thailand for 18 years, but I don't speak Thai well enough to be able to listen to the Thai podcast. Apparently, there's a lot out there, but I just I don't exist in that. There's no bleed. There's no Venn diagram of like, you know, where the English podcast and the Thai podcast mix. I would love to change that, but you know, I have to learn Thai first.
I tell you, I just talked to two English-speaking expat podcasters. That's a long phrase. Who live in Germany this week, and for the Geopats podcast, and they both said they were fluent in German and they don't listen to any German podcasts. So not for any particular reason. They were just like, well, it's easier. Like my relaxing time is in this language, and that's when that's where I listen to podcasts. So.
And let's be honest, I only got so much time in the day. I've got like 50 podcasts I listen to. I mean,
yeah, I've got over
5 more
200 on mine. Yeah,
oh
there's
my God.
too many. Are there any advantages of living where you live as an expat or someone outside the culture?
Specifically related to podcasting or just as a general life?
So your podcast first and then just in general.
For me, I think... I mean, it's kind of self-actualizing. Like the podcast wouldn't exist if I didn't live here because it's such a, like I said before, it's such a rich vein of content. But I think it's a really, I mean, substitute the word podcasting with journalist. I'm sure Eric, you know, after years of working as a journalist, I mean, you're sort of forced to go and find stories or people or interesting angles, and that really opens your mind. And you learn a whole bunch of things about people, about culture, about yourself, about how to deal with issues and problems. And it's just a really mind expanding thing to sort of jump into. So it's just so great to be able to have a voice, to be able to have a platform that forces you to dive into whatever subject you're going to be talking about. It's maybe not the answer you're looking for, but I don't know.
No, I mean, I agree completely with what Greg was saying, that you do see the world in a very different way. And I've done this podcast from Kinshasa, Paris, London, Atlanta, Beijing, Shanghai, and now Ho Chi Minh City. And
I'm not worthy.
So I mean, literally, and now next week I'm doing a show from Tunisia. So we're going to Tunis next week.
Are you bringing your roadcaster with you?
I bring the roadcaster on the road, and off we go. And so, so tune in next month. But for me, so a couple months ago, we had to transition out of Shanghai. My visa ended with my other job, and we were thinking, where do we want to go? And I was very passionate about wanting to stay in the developing world, in part because when you sit in New York or in Paris or in London, you see the world in a different way. This is not a better or worse kind of thing. This is just your world. Here in Saigon, where I live, things don't work properly. Yesterday the rains came and it was, 1.5 feet, 2 feet of water, and the power goes out. And the reason I like that is that it's a pain, but I like it in some ways because it puts me in connection with the people that I am also talking to. So that is the daily existence in most of Africa. That is the daily existence for parts of China. So it's not infrastructure anymore in China, but there are other complications in China. And I really want to channel that in part of the podcast and be connected to that. And so when China is coming into other parts of the world and building infrastructure, and that's a very, very powerful theme in our show, it means something in a place like Vietnam. It doesn't mean something in a place like LA. And so that's one of the reasons for me, I want to stay. So being an expat or being a foreigner really helps me stay humble to the subject that I'm trying to cover. We could have gone anywhere, but we chose to come here.
Yeah, totally.
I agree so much with both of you just said. And Greg, when you were talking about your I kind of want to rephrase what you said a bit. For me, is me being in Shanghai and all of the really interesting things and people that are here internationally and locally is part of what energizes me and got me in the headspace to do the podcast in the first place. So I don't think I would have started this definitely in the US or maybe in another country, but I needed to be in a certain relaxed, financially secure and exciting place in order to do this. And back home, I was too stressed out to do that. So
yeah, I think being an expat also, there's a natural curiosity of the place you're living in because it's new and you want to explore. I mean, I grew up in Calgary in middle of farmland in Canada. I don't know anything about Calgary. I don't know when it was founded. I don't know his sites of history, historical, thing like that. Yeah. I know all that stuff about Bangkok because it's really interesting to me. So there's that natural sort of curiosity about digging into a place that you're new in. That really helps too.
For sure. If I may side rail us a bit, I know we said we're going to take questions later, but this one directly ties in, Eric, to what you just said about the Roadcaster. Swing Down Under asks, oh my God, what travel box are you using for Roadcaster? How do you safely transit?
I have a Porta Brace.
Wow.
Porta Brace makes a Roadcaster case. And I fit 4 mics, 4 headphones, 4 mic stands, and the Roadcaster all in this simple Porta Brace. So
it weighs 1,000 pounds.
It will, believe it. And then what I do is I put this into a big suitcase, and from the bigger, so that way it's packed in a bigger suitcase because I can't take that carry-on. And the reason why I don't take it carry-on is because this again goes back to the discussion about crossing borders and sensitivities of certain governments. If people see you crossing with 4 microphones and a mixing board, it raises kind of at customs or things like that. They go, huh? What's this? And so traveling in Africa and traveling in China, so by putting it in the suitcase, it makes it easier. And I've never been stopped in the suitcase. I have been stopped. And so when I get stopped at borders with it, when I was traveling in the beginning with it last year, they said, what is this? What are you doing? I said, I'm a DJ. And they went, oh, okay, EDM.
Nice.
Oh, that's brilliant.
But
good save. Good save.
That's like a thing, because if all of a sudden they called me on that, because I do like EDM, but I'm not an expert on it. So if they actually called me on it and said, what club are you going to be performing at? What are you going to be doing? You're going to be in a problem. So I recommend packing that inside a suitcase and then checking that in, and then you'll it probably makes it easier across borders.
That's great. And we'll put that information on Twitter later today. Yeah. So you guys can.
The Porta Brace has a good little pack.
Fantastic. Well, this leads very nicely into our next bit, which is what is one piece of advice that you give other expat podcasters if they wanted to start a podcast but we're just unsure of all of the decisions and things they need to think about and do before they press publish?
Well, okay. My first bit of advice would be to invest in good gear, first of all. In season 1 of the show, we didn't know what we were doing, and we went to some random store and we're like, we need a thing, and they said, here's this and this and this, and we literally had pantyhose stretched over us. What's the thing where your grandma does it, the cross point stitching where they push the things in the. We had a thing with pantyhose stretched over that on a coat hanger in front of the microphone. I mean, it worked, but when we interviewed the American ambassador, it didn't look so cool. So I would say invest a couple $100 in at least mid-quality microphones up front, because I go back and listen to season 1 now. I'm like, and the second one would be aware that you're a guest in whatever country you're in. Yes. And you need to be cognizant of that and tread lightly and with respect and be aware of the local rules and regulations.
Yeah, I would echo all that. I mean, the guest in a foreign country, particularly when you're in countries like where I live, which are communist authoritarian countries in China and Vietnam, that guest part is extraordinarily important, and one that is surprisingly overlooked by a large number of people. My biggest piece of advice, it's funny because 10 years ago when I started, I would have kind of disagreed with Greg's assessment on equipment, because I just, back in the day, you get a snowball mic and you just get something and just get going. But I think that podcasting has changed now. And given that NPR and, Gimlet and all the big players are in there, people have gotten accustomed now to a higher quality sound. And just being, just having a shoebox and not good. I listen to podcasts now that don't have good quality sound, and I get annoyed. And I get annoyed simply because, as Greg pointed out, it isn't more than a few $100s.
Right.
It really is not thousands of dollars. It's just a few $100s, and it's super important to do that. So, I have the Shure 7 SM7B, which is made a really great. I mean, that's $700, and I have a Rodecaster. So that's made a big difference. But I think in part, people have that expectation to have a higher quality sound from a professional podcast. The one piece of advice that I give to everybody starting a podcast, regardless of where you are, is consistency. This is what people tell you, is that if you're going to do a show, do the show. And it, for us, we've been every single week without fail, and we take a break at Christmas. Now, if you're going to have a season, then commit to that season and do your 12 episodes. If you're going to do it every other week, then hit every other week. The problem that a lot of people face is they get really excited starting a podcast. I'm going to do it, just like a blog or on a social media account. And they do it for 6 weeks, and then they realize that nobody's listening. I'm always surprised when Rob Walsh on the feed at Libsyn, who's a sponsor, thank you, Butch, says, reveals that the average or the median, I don't know which one it is, number of podcasts that people that get on their stats is 150. And it's a very, very low number. And it really shows you that it's hard to build an audience. It takes a lot of time. We're in the top percentile of all downloads now, according to Rob's statistics. But we've been doing it for 10 years every single week. Right. So that is the key, is just commit to it and do it.
It is. And transparency. If you're going to take a break, tell your listeners so they don't think you've pod faded. Like I take some planned breaks and some unexpected ones, and I just let people know what's happening before it happens.
Episodes in there, do some reruns if you're going to take a month or something. Just have something in the feed that kind of comes through. And, even, This American Life. I mean, he says this is a rebroadcast from 3 years ago. It's perfectly acceptable to do that. But there's something in that feed, and that habit is kept up.
Yeah. And there's building on the community thing. There's a strong sense of community in podcasting, and your listeners have a lot of choices, and they're used to podcasts being niche and being personal. And when people say, "Oh, how do I publicize my podcast?" to me, I'm like, where are you? What communities are you in? Who are you talking to? Who are you talking with? Tell them. Don't just go randomly try to find tons of people to listen to your podcast. You want people that are going to engage with the content, not just anybody out there.
Right. Do it for the love. Start a podcast for the same reason you start a blog, because you love to do it. Don't look for money. Don't do it for someone. Someone on Twitter replied to me a while ago. He said, "I know you got into podcasting for the easy money." I was like, really?
I said, no one ever. Wow. If they knew what they were talking about. Easy money. And my second piece of advice, because I can't do anything with just one answer, is flexibility. A lot of times when you start a podcast, you'll think you'll know exactly what's going to be, and it could change, especially within the first 6 months. So just be flexible to let the project tell you what it's going to turn into. Yeah.
Good advice, everyone.
Thank you. Do we want to talk about funding? That's such a sticky wicket, isn't it? It's a giant.
Okay. So this isn't easy money. This is not something you're going to get rich off of. I avoided all expectations that I was ever going to get advertising and going to advertise mattresses and, I probably shouldn't say that. First of all, when I talked to them, I didn't like the way that these ad companies were kind of talking to us, because they basically, 5,000 per episode, 5,000 downloads per episode is kind of the benchmark that they want. I just felt that if the ads don't fit with your content. So my favorite podcast, they took some ads again for mattress companies or for things that are completely off. And I just thought, and it's not, and then you look at the CPMs for them, and it's so low. I mean, it's like a Google ad on your website. And I just said, it's not worth it. So I've decided to go into a different, I get foundation funding. So I get from Ford Foundation, I get from the European Climate Commission, I get some other, I get various foundations to underwrite. Part of it, and when you listen to our podcast, you see there's an ad right at the top. This podcast is brought to you by the Africa-China Reporting Project. That's from the Ford Foundation. And they underwrite the costs for the show. So it achieves the same objective, but I've been able to find a partner that is aligned with the content that I am actually producing. So it doesn't sound jarring to the listener that I'm all of a sudden advertising milk on a China-Africa podcast. I'm advertising, for me, I'm promoting Africa-China journalism training on a China-Africa podcast. That makes sense. And that's been a very good partnership for all of us, for them and for us.
That's so true. Yeah.
I totally agree. And for our show, for the Bangkok podcast, we don't do any advertising. Mm-hmm. I don't like advertising traditionally. I understand why it exists and I understand how it's necessary, but we have chosen not to do that. We might change that in the future, although I don't think so. But if we did, it would be such a narrow focus, like you said, Eric, with things that we do use, the things that we support and love in our regular daily lives. I really don't like listening to podcasts now, and I listen to a lot of podcasts where the hosts take a 4-minute break to talk about something that's totally not related. And it's just like, I know you're getting paid to say this. It loses all relevance to me because you're getting paid to say it. I don't like that. So for our show, we've gone strictly with Patreon, and we give our patrons every week they get an extra bonus episode. So we record 2 shows a week. Actually, one show goes out to everyone, and one show goes and one show also goes out to the patrons only. And we do things like we do behind the scenes photos, and we put pictures and things like that. So we provide extra content for our patrons, and that's how we do it. We're not making a lot of money, but we are making enough to cover the cost of production and maybe buy a few beers here and there. But that's the path that we've chosen, and that's I feel good about that.
But let me make one other quick point, Stephanie, before I come back to you, which is for me, it's always been I only got my first funding last year. So it's been very relatively recent. So for 9 of the 10 years, it was like Greg, where I didn't have any advertising. But it's interesting because people said, well, how are you making money on this? And I said, well, I'm not making money directly from the podcast, but just because of the podcast and what I'm doing in social media, my whole professional profile was raised. I got better jobs because of it. I remember when I sat down for the interview for the editor-in-chief position at France 24, they said, you know what, we don't have to ask you about social and digital media because we can see that you already get it. And that helped me. And then I got a job at WPP Shanghai, where you and I met, Steph. Same thing. They in fact hired me in part because of the high social media profile that I had. So I will say that by doing podcasting, you're actually earning money by improving your visibility, your profile, and demonstrating to future employers that you get it. So it's not a direct A to B connection, but it is something that will help you in the long run if you do it, because you're showing people that you can actually create content, build an audience, manage a community, and have the commitment to do it right. And that helps you in finding jobs and improving your employment process.
I think that's really important to add, because I'm in the process of transitioning to a different country, and I'm applying completely out of the field I've been in for over a decade. But I'm using the podcasting community, social media, and all of my marketing and stuff to leverage myself into digital marketing in a different country. And I'm getting interview requests. I have no formal training in it. I've just got the stuff they can see online. And I'm guessing it's because I can list out the things and I have the skills and all these kinds of things, that's something that they can see and that they're going, oh, she can do it. And I'm like, okay, I hope, I don't know, wish me luck. But
I think of it as like a living resume, as a living CV online, right?
Yeah. And they're like, okay, you need to make a video. I'm like, oh, you want just one? Oh, okay. All right, sure. Yeah, for me, for Geopat's podcast, I've just started monetizing a couple of months ago. I'm doing affiliates mostly. I've got Podbean as the host for that podcast, and there's a really nice affiliate program with them. And so I'm doing that. I'm trying to find affiliates that cover any expat or anybody wanting to be an expat in any country. For example, Chase Sapphire credit card works anywhere. And you have no, like when I use it, I get no foreign transaction fee. So that helps me live and travel overseas. And that's something that I think would be useful for any expat or anybody.
Paid post, by the way. Did you just give an ad right there?
StephFuccio.com/affiliates. Yes, I'm trying to monetize. So we're doing things like that, traveling mailboxes where you can have your mail a U.S. address. If you're an American citizen, if you're an American expat, you can have a U.S. address and you can have your stuff scanned and sent to you via email. So I'm doing stuff like that that's relevant to expats and geopats globally. So I'm trying to have that kind of stuff in there. In the podcast itself, I don't do ads necessarily, but I do promos from other podcasts and projects that are connected to what we're talking about in that episode. And so I'm kind of collecting other audio projects and putting them into the episode kind of as an extra resource.
Right.
But those are free. I'm not charging for those at all. And I never will. I don't want to. I want the podcast to be useful, not just storytelling, but also to provide some steps if people are thinking about being expats.
One other thing on money that you have to be careful about. So we have never been in this situation, but because we're in such a sensitive topic area, like China, for example, where a lot of people kind of look at you and go, well, are you pro-China or anti-China, or what's your kind of take on it? So if Huawei came to me and said, I'm going to give you $100,000 to sponsor your show, I couldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Right. I mean, it would be great. It would be amazing, but it would undermine all my credibility and the future of my show and the legitimacy of my show. Same if I got money from the US government. We only take from foundations. I mean, again, we have a very small number of people we can take money from. So that are absolutely 100% neutral and don't complicate this question of where we are. So we don't take money, and it's not been a really difficult issue for us because Huawei has not come to us with $100,000. Nobody has.
Me neither.
It does bring up the point, though, that we cannot have any funding. And one of the things that you'll do if you go to our website, ChinaAfricaProject.com/about, or about us, just on our homepage, I list out all of our money. Because I've had issues where people say, wait, are you doing propaganda for the Americans or for the Chinese? And so I've had to be incredibly transparent. And I really believe that if you are taking money, that you should tell your audience where it's coming from so they know about it. And this is one of the benefits of podcasting, is that we have a much closer relationship, or we should, with our audience. And part of the appeal is that they get to know us as people, not Anderson Cooper, or CNN, but they can talk to Greg or Steph or me. They can email us and say, hey, how are you doing? And I think that relationship on the trust factor, but related to money, is also very important. So for us, everything is out there. We don't hide anything. If you have any questions about where our money comes from, most of it's been self-funded by me, but what little we do get, I put out on the web. But be careful where you take money from, because it can undermine your credibility depending on what subject you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, totally. And that goes to what you said, Stephanie, but too about transparency and doing a weekly show, especially. I mean, you've got you need to create conversations. So I talk about my friends, my day, my work, my wife, and your audience gets to know you on a weirdly personal level. I was going to say something else about funding too, but I lost the train of thought. But it's people get to know you, and it's a weird sort of intimacy, and it happens with me too. I'm fans of show where I feel like I know the hosts, but to him, I'm just some weirdo online who's saying, "Hey, I'm a fan and I like the show." But it's transparency, and it's just building a rapport with your audience and being honest with them.
Yeah. Speaking of transparency, when I started to gather you all to do this panel, it was just meant to be this panel. And after we talked about the different aspects of it we wanted to do, I started to decide to do a show on the Geopats podcast with Expat Podcasters. And I have very accidentally already recorded the first 2 episodes, and they're up on Geopats Podcast now. So the panel did come first. Greg and Eric inspired me to include that in the expat realm, niche realm that Geopat Podcast is. So I want to thank both of you for your part in that.
I'll send you my bill for the license fee.
Okay, great. Also, well, let's go around and tell people where they can find us and our projects. Greg.
All right. Well, we're BangkokPodcast.com. We're on Spotify. We're on iTunes. We're on all the social medias at Bangkok Podcast, BangkokPodcast@gmail.com. The website is our main thing, I guess. It doesn't get, I'm not sure. I'm going to sort of Shanghai this question. No pun intended. Do you think a website is necessary for podcasts these days?
I do, because I think for search, I think Google does still like websites, and it's a good way for the Google bot to kind of piece together who you are, and a website is still part of that. And if you're missing on the web, then Google, which a lot of other third-party sites rely on for guidance as to kind of who you are in the ecosystem. So in that sense, I do think, but it maybe it's just use it like the Libsyn gives you a free or a very simple website, so you don't actually have to maintain one necessarily, but having a web presence of some kind, I think that makes sense.
I've started to play around with SEO on my non-host podcasting host site. It's Weebly, but I've bought a .com, so it kind of doesn't look like a Weebly. And I've played with the SEO, and my hits are going up. So I think people are finding the website, then going to the podcast, and some people are finding the podcast, then going to the website. So it's going both ways now, and it has increased my traffic quite a bit.
Yeah, I just don't know how much work to put into it, and I've put in a lot of work into it recently because we're opening a swag store, like we're selling T-shirts and stuff like that. Yeah, which is because why not? But I like having a website. I'm not sure how much it's how central it is to the existence of the whole thing. Anyway, it's just a random thought I had. But you're right, Eric. It is important to have one. I just don't know how big it needs to be.
Yeah,
I don't think it needs to be big. I just think it needs to have a little bit of SEO. I seriously did like 2 chapters in a book, typed in a few keywords, and it went. Whoosh. So we can talk about this later if you want.
So that being said, I've gone in exactly the opposite direction.
Yeah, you have.
So
your website is amazing, Eric.
I've now devoted full time. Now I'm now working full time on China Africa Project. So if you go to ChinaAfricaProject.com, just last week relaunched the website. With original content, news feeds, podcasts, something we just launched today called the Student Exchange, where we're getting high school and college kids around the world to comment on China-Africa relations. We've got an expert network. So this has now become a kind of central hub in the world of China watching and Africa watching for it. I am then also next week going to start or the week after, a daily email newsletter that people can subscribe to with news daily. Wow. Every single day. And the podcast will be part of that, but it's really just one part of it. So Greg, you have Greg on one side wondering about the web, and I'm on the other side who's just now diving full into it and using the podcast in that sense. So we get about 30 to 40,000 downloads a month. Is going to be a kind of channel to market all the various services in the paid email. So again, you think about what's the monetization and revenue strategy. So I want to drive people to subscriptions to get this daily email kind of intelligence brief on China-Africa relations, and the podcast will be a part of that. So ChinaAfricaProject.com. Also on LinkedIn, you can look me up, Eric Olander, and we've got about 860,000 people doing a great daily discussion on China-Africa issues. And then Twitter, Eolander, Eolander, also a great discussion that goes on. Each one of those has different discussions. So on LinkedIn, which is really a very, very special platform, and I really recommend that you keep this in mind as a social media platform. A lot of people just think it's a job board kind of thing. But for me, LinkedIn is the only platform, the only social media channel where the Chinese can interact with the outside world. This is the only, there is no Facebook, there is no Twitter, there is no YouTube. So the splinternet, except LinkedIn. So it's one of those places where Africans, Chinese, and international people all come together. And that's one of the only places in the world that happens. And so that's really exciting to kind of see those interactions.
Interesting.
Yeah. Wow. And Eric, you actually inspired me to start a newsletter. Mine's not the same because mine's more of storytelling, and it's very, 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 very work in progress. But I'm doing a weekly newsletter now for Geopats in order to put the affiliates and different things in people's hands, as well as give a behind the mic kind of view of the different things that are going on. But everything I do is on StephFuccio.com. It's why I put my name over here, because it's hard to spell. So StephFuccio.com is where absolutely everything is. One final thing, Dave. Nicole Palazzo of the Expat Cast is doing a live International Podcast Day event in Freiburg, Germany. She is another expat podcaster, and she's doing that. Let's see if I can get the time difference. It's 6:30 p.m. on Monday, September 30th, which is 12:30 p.m. September 30th Eastern Standard Time. Time zones exhaust me.
Yeah, no kidding.
Well, we want to thank you guys so much for coming in. This was definitely a new podcast day experience. I know for myself, listening to the three of you, and I know it's a new topic of conversation for the International Podcast Day community as well. So Steve and I were chatting behind the scenes here about this. Just a fascinating conversation. It's something, that we really wanted to highlight. This International Podcast Day is just, what you all are doing out there, and the connections we have, and the connections you're sharing, the relationships you're building. So I can't thank you enough. Go ahead, Steph.
Can I say one more thing? Again, I'm starting to interview expat podcasters for the Geopats podcast for one of our shows. So if there are any expats out there who want to start a podcast or who are doing a podcast, do contact me. I want to talk to you. Thank you.
Sounds awesome. Well, Steph, Greg, Eric, I can't thank you enough for getting this organized. I know you guys are in different time zones. You're in different countries. I love it that you were able to come together and celebrate International Podcast Day together. So on behalf of myself and the entire International Podcast Day team, thank you again for joining us. And we will be back in a few minutes with another session. We appreciate it. Thanks.
Bye, everybody. Bye. That was awesome. Right.